This is not a story I ever wanted to tell, but if you listen to the end, you'll understand why I had no choice. My downfall began with a single word printed on a name badge. A word so humiliating it erased years of love in an instant. That wedding should have been the happiest day for my granddaughter. Instead, it became the day a suspicion crept in. My family might be ready to strip me of everything, even my dignity. And that was only the beginning, so let's start my story. At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed that my name badge didn't say Alina Carter, grandmother of the bride. Instead, in elegant calligraphy, it read, Alina Carter, financial guardian angel, sponsor of happiness. When my son said it was just a joke, I smiled and quietly asked him if he was ready to return the inheritance his father had left him in the will. My name is Alina Carter. I'm 65 years old. I had always believed that family celebrations were meant to be moments of joy. My granddaughter Julia's wedding was supposed to be one of those perfect days, the kind you carry in your heart forever. But instead, it became the day I finally saw the truth. The day I realized how my family truly saw me. That morning, I spent a long time getting ready. At 65, I am not vain, but I still wanted to look beautiful. I chose a light coral dress, the one my late husband Henry had always loved. I carefully arranged my grey hair and dabbed on a touch of perfume, the very bottle Henry had given me for our last anniversary together. Looking in the mirror, I told myself I looked lovely. I imagined Henry whispering those words back to me. For a brief moment, I felt his presence close by. The ceremony at St. Mark's Church was beautiful. Julia looked radiant walking down the aisle, her face glowing with happiness. My son David walked proudly beside her. Even Linda, my daughter-in-law, seemed genuinely moved. For those short moments, everything appeared perfect. But it all changed at the reception. The Westbrook Hotel ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and polished floors. At the registration table, guests were receiving their name badges and table assignments. A young woman behind the desk smiled as she searched through the cards. When she found mine, she beamed and handed it to me. I looked down, expecting to see Alina Carter, grandmother of the bride. Instead, it read, Alina Carter, financial guardian angel, sponsor of happiness. My hand froze halfway. Surely it had to be a mistake. The young woman noticed my face and asked if something was wrong. I forced a smile and said there must have been a mix-up. She leaned closer, her eyes widening when she read it. She apologized and offered to check if there was another badge. I shook my head quickly. I wasn't going to create a scene at Julia's wedding. I promised myself I'd address it later with the family. So I pinned the insulting badge to my dress and walked into the ballroom. My cheeks burned with humiliation. Had Julia proved this? Or David? Or Linda? Who could have thought this was appropriate, let alone funny? During the cocktail hour, I tried to enjoy myself, chatting with other guests. Some ignored the badge, others were perhaps too polite to mention it. But then I overheard something that froze my blood. One guest whispered with a smirk, asking if the other had noticed the grandmother's badge. The reply came with a chuckle. Linda thought it would be amusing. After all, wasn't I their personal ATM? My hands trembled as I turned away. Just then David spotted me. He called me over to a group of well-dressed guests. His voice carried across the room as he introduced me to the Harrison family. He explained that Henry used to play golf with Bill Harrison, their patriarch. Reluctantly, I joined them. Bill Harrison's face looked familiar, one of Henry's old business partners, perhaps. David introduced me to Bill and his wife, Martha, and then, with a laugh, added that I was their walking sponsor of happiness. Martha's smile faltered as her eyes fell on my badge. Bill shifted awkwardly. I straightened my shoulders and firmly introduced myself as Alina Carter, Henry's widow. Bill responded warmly, saying Henry often spoke of me and was always proud of me. The conversation continued, but I barely heard it. When they moved on, I pulled David aside. I asked him what the badge meant, pointing at the offensive card. He laughed, telling me not to be so sensitive. It was just a joke, he said. Everyone knew I had deep pockets ever since Henry left me everything. I whispered that it was humiliating. He rolled his eyes, told me to relax, reminded me it was a party. Before I could answer, Linda appeared, elegant in her gown. She asked if David was introducing me to everyone, adding brightly that they wanted people to know who had made this spectacular wedding possible. Then she winked. David and Linda both laughed. I excused myself and went to the restroom. My eyes stung as I dabbed them with a tissue. That's when the door opened, and a well-dressed older man stepped in, then quickly backed out, apologizing. It was Charles Whitman, Henry's longtime attorney. He asked if he could speak with me. I composed myself and followed him out. Charles had always been kind to me. He said he couldn't help but notice my badge, and he had overheard a few comments as well. I sighed, brushing it off as a joke. His expression darkened. He said it wasn't funny. Henry would have been furious. Then he lowered his voice. There was something I needed to know. Something Henry had insisted remained hidden unless it ever became necessary. From his jacket pocket he drew an envelope. Inside was an addendum to Henry's will, written shortly before his death. My fingers trembled as I read it. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. Any descendant who publicly humiliated me would forfeit their inheritance. Amy's estate was far larger than I had ever imagined. I looked up at Charles, shaken. Why hadn't Henry told me? He said Henry hoped it would never come to this. He wanted the family to treat me well out of love, not fear. I glanced back toward the ballroom where my family laughed and celebrated. They had no idea that their behavior had just cost them millions. Charles asked me what I wanted to do. I carefully folded the document and handed it back. I told him nothing for now. I wanted to see how far they would go. When I rejoined the reception, the badge felt heavier on my chest. But now, instead of shame, I felt something stirring inside me. A quiet resolve to finally see my family for who they truly were. And this was only the beginning of my discoveries about the people I once called my own. The morning after the wedding, I sat alone at the kitchen table in my robe. In front of me lay that humiliating badge. The elegant calligraphy mocked me. To me it read like grandmother, the family wallet on leg. I traced the letters with my finger, thinking of how my late husband Henry would have reacted. His anger was rare, but when it appeared, it was terrifying, especially if someone disrespected the people he loved. They've changed, I whispered into the empty room. Or maybe had they always been this way? I walked into the living room and stood before the large family portrait above the fireplace. It had been taken 5 years earlier on our 40th anniversary. Henry sat in the center, looking strong and dignified. I stood beside him, my hand resting on his shoulder. My son David and my daughter-in-law Linda stood close, and in front of us Julia and Ethan, still teenagers then. We looked happy. When exactly had it all shifted? That question haunted me. Perhaps the changes had been gradual, so subtle I didn't notice the erosion of respect. The first clear memory came back to me. It happened just 6 months after Henry's funeral. David and Linda invited me to dinner unusual for them. They were uncommonly attentive, asking about my well-being, recalling Henry with warm words. But over dessert, the true purpose of the evening surfaced. David mentioned the kitchen renovation. Nothing major, he explained. Just updating the appliances, new countertops. I said it sounded wonderful, never suspecting what was coming. Linda continued softly, adding that with tuition and other expenses, money was tight. I remember the pause, their expectant glances. David quickly clarified, they weren't asking for money. But since Henry had left me well provided for, They thought I might want to help the family. That same evening, I wrote them a check for $30,000. Looking back, that was the beginning. But the small request kept growing. The kitchen remodel became a full home reconstruction. Help with education turned into luxury cars for Julia and Ethan, my grandchildren. I opened the cabinet and pulled out a box of records. I sat on the floor like a schoolgirl, sorting through bank statements and checks. The numbers told the story clearly. My support of their lifestyle was enormous. In just 3 years, I had given them nearly $250,000. The phone rang. It was Linda. She asked if I was home. She said she had tried my cell, but I hadn't noticed it was still in my evening purse. I told her I was home and asked if everything was all right. Linda's voice was bright. She said she just wanted to thank me on behalf of her and David for everything yesterday. Wasn't the wedding beautiful? Yes, I answered. It was. She continued, saying Julia and Mark, my granddaughter and her groom, were deeply grateful for my generosity. They could never have had such a magnificent wedding without me. I closed my eyes, remembering the check for $45,000 I had written for the venue and catering. I said I was glad I could help. That's actually why I'm calling, Linda continued, her voice taking on that sugary tone I had learned to recognize. Mark's parents had promised to pay for the honeymoon, but Mark's father's business was struggling. They had to back out. Julia was terribly upset. I waited, knowing what was coming. Linda didn't delay. She explained that she and David thought I could step in. Julia and Mark dreamed of 2 weeks in Bali. Of course, David and Linda had contributed to the wedding, but I had covered almost everything. I told Linda I would think about it. My response surprised both of us. There was a pause. She reminded me the trip needed to be booked soon to secure good rates. I understand, I said. I'll let you know within a week. After the call, I returned to my financial records. Henry had always warned me our son sees money as the answer to everything. But money without values only breeds more problems. At the time I hadn't understood. Or perhaps I hadn't wanted to. A knock at the door startled me. Through the peephole I saw Ethan, my grandson. He shifted nervously on the porch. I hurried to gather the financial papers and hide them in the cabinet before opening the door. Ethan stepped forward to hug me. At 21 he was tall, like his grandfather, with the same kind eyes. He asked how I was feeling. He often texted me to check in. I'm fine, dear, I answered. Just tired from yesterday. Come in. He followed me into the kitchen while I put the kettle on. Ethan was always more thoughtful than the others, less obsessed with appearances and status. He said he wanted to apologize for yesterday. For the badge. For the way people spoke. It was wrong. A lump formed in my throat. I patted his hand and explained about responsibility, that when something is wrong, it's not his burden to fix his parents' behavior. It is my duty to stand up for what's right. He looked at me seriously. He admitted that his father and Linda had changed since Hemi's death. All they ever talked about now was money. Specifically, my money. What do you mean? I asked. Ethan told me he had overheard a conversation the week before. David said my house was too big for one person. They had discussed helping me move to a smaller place. The kettle whistled, giving me a moment to absorb this. As I poured the hot water, my mind raced to Charles Whitman, our family attorney, to Henry's addendum, to that badge, to the endless requests. And now this plan to move me out. Ethan's voice pulled me back. He asked how I was doing. I placed the kettle on the table and sat across from him. I told him honestly, for the first time in years, I was beginning to see things clearly. What do you mean? He asked. I smiled faintly. It's time for change, I said. As we drank tea, I studied his face, wondering how different he truly was from his parents. Or perhaps selfishness only slept inside him, waiting for its chance to awaken. For the first time since Henry's death, I felt a cold clarity. I would make no rash decisions, but I would watch. I would wait. I would see who in his family truly deserved Henry's inheritance. 2 days after the wedding, David and Linda organized a post-wedding brunch. It was held at a country club. I hesitated about attending, but curiosity won. I needed to know whether the badge had been a one-time insult or something deeper. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club wearing a cream pantsuit. Henry always said it made me look regal. As I entered the dining hall, I saw familiar faces from the wedding: Julia with her new husband Mark, Ethan, and other relatives and friends. "Mom, over here," David called, waving from the head table. Linda, radiant in a designer dress that must have cost a fortune, blew me a kiss and complimented my appearance. Her tone carried a trace of surprise. "We saved you a seat," Linda announced. I sat down, noticing my place was next to Mark's parents, a people I barely knew, and not beside my own grandchildren. The brunch went pleasantly enough until Linda tapped her glass for attention. She began by thanking everyone for making Julia and Mark's wedding so special, adding a special thanks to me, grandmother Elena, for my incredible generosity. Then she smiled and made the announcement I would be paying for Julia and Mark's dream honeymoon in Bali. Applause followed. I sat frozen, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. I had never agreed to this. Carefully, I set the cup down and said, in a steady voice, that this was the first I had heard of it. An awkward silence swept the room. Julia looked embarrassed. Mark stared at his plate. "But we discussed it recently," Linda insisted with a strained laugh, reminding me of my words. I had said I'd think about it. "Yes, I said that, and I am still thinking," I replied. David leaned in, whispering loud enough for others to hear, telling me not to cause a scene. They had already told the newlyweds the trip could be booked. Something snapped inside me. A thread stretched too far had finally broken. Loud enough for all, I declared I had not agreed to fund a honeymoon in Bali. I added that Mark's parents had originally promised to cover it. Mark's father shifted uncomfortably, muttering about business troubles. I replied kindly, saying such things happen, but it is improper to publicly assign someone else's money without their consent. Isn't it? The guests fell silent. Linda's face flushed crimson. "Perhaps Julia and Mark could consider a more modest honeymoon," I suggested. "One within their means. Within their means," Linda hissed. "What about your means? Everyone knows about Henry's inheritance." Something in her tone made my decision even clearer. "My finances are not a matter for public discussion," I said firmly. "Nor is how I choose to spend my money." David grabbed my hand painfully, begging me to stop, saying I was embarrassing them. I pulled my hand away. "No, David, you are embarrassing yourselves." I rose, smoothing my jacket, and turned to Julia and Mark, wishing them happiness. I said I was willing to contribute to a reasonable honeymoon, but that we would discuss it privately. As I turned to leave, Ethan rose too. He offered to walk me out. In the hallway, my composure broke. My hands trembled as I searched for my keys. "Let me drive," Ethan offered gently. I nodded, breathing deeply. "I'm fine, just shaken." He told me I had behaved with dignity, that it had taken courage. I looked at him and, for a moment, he so resembled Henry that my heart ached. On impulse, I asked if he would like to come to dinner. Ethan smiled. He was glad to. Later that evening we sat in my kitchen, sharing a simple meal of roasted chicken. I told my grandson about his parents' behavior over the last 3 years, the constant demands, the gradual loss of respect. He agreed. He had seen it himself. Since Henry's death, they treated me like an ATM. In my mind, the words on that badge echoed, Elena Carter, financial guardian angel, sponsor of happiness. Or more simply, grandmother, the family wallet on legs. But that was only the beginning. You can't imagine what happened next. When the door slammed behind my son and his heavy steps echoed through the hallway, I realized this was the moment of truth. Not a quarrel, not a misunderstanding, but the confrontation that had been inevitable for years. His eyes burned with anger, his every movement radiated contempt. Before me stood not the boy I once held by the hand, but a man consumed by entitlement, convinced that everything of mine was already his. His words lashed out like a whip. He accused me of humiliating them at the brunch, of disgracing the family, of refusing to play the role they had assigned me, the silent benefactor. There was no gratitude in his voice, no respect. Only demands, sharpened by resentment. I listened, and each phrase struck me like a blow. But instead of guilt, something else stirred within me. A cold clarity mixed with exhaustion. For years I had excused their behavior, telling myself that love required sacrifice. But love without respect is not love. It is exploitation. I looked at David and saw not my son, but a stranger. A stranger whose eyes calculated not my well-being, but the price of the walls around me. He spoke of the house, how it was too large for one woman, how everyone would benefit if I moved somewhere smaller. His tone was final, like a verdict. My home, my sanctuary, my memories with Henry were nothing to him but equity on a hot market. A chill spread through me, but I held my composure. I would not let him see me tremble. Behind him stood Ethan, silent, but his silence spoke volumes. My grandson's eyes reflected both fear and shame, fear of his father's rage and shame at what he was witnessing. I thought of the family portrait above the fireplace taken just a few years ago. How carefully I had convinced myself that we were happy. And now, seeing my son's twisted face, I understood the cracks had been there all along. I had simply refused to look at them. I tried to steady my breathing. The ticking of the clock, the glow of the lamp, Henry's photo on the mantel, these became my anchors. I reminded myself I am not just a purse. I am a woman, a wife, a mother, and I will not be erased. David's voice grew sharper. He no longer asked, he demanded. He painted pictures of my future as if he had the right to dictate it. A smaller apartment, assisted living, anything that freed the house for them to sell. The knots arose in me. They didn't just want my money. They wanted my home, the very ground under my feet. And yet, as he spoke, I felt a shift inside myself. Fear began to drain away, replaced by resolve. For the first time in years, I was no longer bending. I thought of Henry, his foresight, his hand on mine when he spoke of protecting me after he was gone. The addendum he had left tucked away with Charles Whitman, waiting for a moment like this. A shield written in ink, backed by law, born of love. I realized I wasn't powerless. I had been quiet for too long, mistaking silence for peace. But silence had only emboldened them. That night, after David stormed out, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt hollow, the air heavy. Yet within that emptiness, I found something unexpected relief. The mask had finally fallen. I no longer needed to pretend that my son loved me for who I was. He had made his choice, and now I would make mine. For the first time since Henry's death, I felt strength. Fragile, yes, but real. A strength rooted not in denial, but in truth. I would no longer be the background figure in my own life. The time had come to defend my dignity, and this was only the prelude to what awaited us all. The house fell silent after David left, his anger still hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. I sat motionless, listening to the ticking of the clock, and knew nothing was accidental anymore. We had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Morning brought not relief, but weariness. The tea in my cup had gone cold, leaving a bitter ring on the porcelain, a mark of the night that had passed. I wrapped myself in the old cardigan I had worn in my first years of widowhood, its heaviness strangely comforting. From above the mantel, Henry's portrait looked down on me. His gaze was stern, yet I felt his approval. It was as if he had foreseen this very day. I began to list what I still had. Not bank accounts or numbers, but the things no one could steal: my name, my house where our laughter had once echoed, the garden Henry and I planted together, the memory of decades lived side by side. All of it was part of me, and all of it my son wanted to turn into merchandise. On the table lay the badge with its mocking inscription. Yesterday it stung, today it was just paper. I tucked it into a box with other things that no longer had power over me. I spread out the checks, receipts, and letters. Once I had seen in them proof of my weakness, as if I hadn't done enough. Now they told a different story, years of saying yes too often. Every psalm, every signature reminded me of how my love had become their expectation. Helping was one thing, being forced into obligation was another. But the final blow came when David spoke plainly. No more hints, no more polite requests. They had decided to move me out. The house was too big, the cost too high, and in their plans, it was already sold. My place, they said, was somewhere smaller, quieter, where my steps would not echo. I listened and understood. This was no longer a conversation. This was a sentence. My past, my memories, my years, all of it they were ready to erase for profit. And then I remembered Henry's words. He had left an addendum to the will for precisely such a moment. His hand had written what mine could not. In those lines was not cold calculation but care. He had known that one day I would face greed within my own family, and he had left me a shield. I closed my eyes and felt the fear drain away with the pain. It was clear now I was no longer a victim. I was the keeper of the house, of memory, of name. If David wanted to put a period on my life, it would not be his period. It would be mine. I wrote a letter to Julia and her husband. Inside was a modest check, not lavish, but enough for a simple trip and, more importantly, words. Help is only possible when there is respect. It was not about money. It was about rules. Each week, I placed fresh roses in a vase and trimmed away the wilted ones. Henry used to say that a garden must be tended, or beauty will suffocate under weeds. Now I understood. The same is true of family. I knew what lay ahead. Not a party, not a brunch, but a conversation where truth would be spoken. I would gather them in my home. I would sit in Henry's chair, the papers beside me, and with the lawyer present, we would open the addendum that would change everything. I had no intention of shouting, no intention of justifying myself. I wanted only order and clarity. Henry would be with me in the portrait above the fireplace, in the words he had left behind. That thought brought me peace. I awaited the next day. At noon, by my request, the lawyer had summoned the family. A day when truth would rise above greed. And that day was already close. I remember the morning of that family meeting as one of unusual stillness. I rose early, as though life itself urged me not to delay. Outside, the garden lay grey, damp with dew. I stepped barefoot onto the porch, inhaled the smell of wet earth, and knew everything was already decided. I set the table in the living room. A vase of roses freshly trimmed. The folder of papers not for display, but for me. My shield, my memory of Henry, his final act of care. Ethan arrived first. His steps were cautious, his gaze attentive. He helped move the chairs, set down teacups without a word. His silence was my strongest support. Then the others arrived. I heard the car, the door opening, and inside me everything went still. David entered, tense and rigid, with Linda beside him, collected, cold, as always. Julia held her husband's hand, her face marked with fear. She understood this day would shape not just my future, but her own place in the family. We sat in the living room. The air felt heavy, as if even the walls awaited my words. I began with the simple truths, what I remembered from the wedding, from the badge, from the brunch. I spoke slowly, calmly, without reproach, but every word landed with the weight of a stone. Then I spoke of David's word, his plan to move me, to sell my home. I said it evenly, without shouting, but inside my voice roared louder than any outburst. In that moment, I was not only recounting events. I was drawing a line. The lawyer placed on the table a copy of Henry's addendum. The terms were clear. Any heir who publicly humiliated me or tried to deprive me of my home would lose their inheritance. It was not punishment. It was older foresight from a man who had known both me and our family better than I wished to admit. I looked at my son. He tried to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. I saw fury and confusion collide in his eyes. He had not expected his plans to meet not with my submission but with Henry's will, made law. Linda turned away, her hands trembling. She had lived on certainty, and now the ground had vanished beneath her. Ethan sat quietly by my side, his presence warm. Julia wept, but her tears were not only of shame, they held a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, I saw that she was ready to choose truth over convenience. I told them I was not casting anyone out of my life, but my life would no longer be a banquet where everyone took without invitation. My house remained mine. My name remained mine. My dignity remained mine. And now it was secured not only by my decision, but by Henry's will. Silence followed. No one found words. Each was lost in thought of what was lost, what remained, what might still be saved. I, meanwhile, felt relief. At last the burden I had carried for years shifted from my shoulders onto the paper, the signature, the law. When they left, I did not hold anyone back. Only Julia lingered, her eyes meeting mine with a question, "Can trust ever be restored?" I gave her a small nod. For her, the door would remain open. That evening I stepped once more into the garden. The roses smelled fresh. The autumn wind carried its chill. I sat on the bench and looked at the house. It stood firm, and with it, so did I. This was no longer their project for profit. It was my home again. I thought of Henry. He was with me in every step. His care had become my shield, his wisdom my weapon. He had left me more than an inheritance. He had left me the chance to remain myself until the end. I knew there would still be waves. But now I had a shore I defended not only for myself, but for those who would one day understand the value of true family. And this was not an ending, but a new beginning of the next page of my life. I look back on everything that happened and wonder, what would have become of me if I had stayed silent once more? Would I have lost my home, my name, my memory of Henry? Tell me, would you forgive your own son if he tried to move you out of your life for his gain? Would you leave the door open, or close it forever? How often do we hide behind the phrase, "but their family," when in truth it is nothing more than exploitation? And where is that boundary between love and obligation, between help and humiliation? I made my choice. What choice would you make? That's the end of today's story. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading what you have to say. If you'd like more, check out the full playlist linked in the description of this video. New real stories are on the way, and I'd love to share them with you. Hopefully, I'll see you next time. If this journey resonated with you, please hit subscribe and tap the bell so you'll never miss the latest stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, even the hardest drama stories can lead to freedom and dignity.